Okay, we have talked about dual federalism, and dual federalism is kind of an older way of thinking about the national and state government relationships. We want to think about a more modern interpretation of federalism and a more modern understanding of how the national government and the state governments interact. And so we're going to talk about cooperative federalism. You can hear it right there in the name. There's a lot more working together. You guys read in the book, you see that this is a lot more sharing of power between the national government and the state governments. But I do want you to keep in mind, this is more like a big brother, little brother sharing. This is always uneven sharing, and it almost always means that the national government is taking control of what the states used to be able to have the powers to decide. All this is going to start with an amendment that you should be very familiar with. This is the 14th Amendment. We know about the 14th Amendment. We know that the 14th Amendment was written in order to give citizenship rights to people who had been enslaved. It did more than just give them citizenship. It had to define how the state had to treat its citizens so that it would ensure that these states that had had slavery would not be able to mistreat these new citizens. So it gives protections for citizens in the 14th Amendment, and these protections are going to apply to all citizens. And so this is going to change the relationship between the national and state government. There's two huge parts of this amendment. The first one is the Equal Protection Clause. It says that states must treat all people equally under the law. So this is the 14th Amendment now tells the state governments that they must treat all citizens equally, and that this is in the Constitution. And so that gives the national government the power to ensure that the state governments are not discriminating against their citizens. It also includes what we call the Due Process Clause. This is the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. It says that states cannot deny anybody life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So this tells the state governments that they can no longer take away the liberties or the freedoms of their citizens without giving those citizens a fair process, a fair treatment under the law. And so this also gives the national government the power to enforce this law in the state. So these two clauses together, the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause, these give the national government a whole lot of power to now get involved in state activities. So things that used to be state policies now might involve the national government. If your state is running separate school systems for people according to their race, then now the 14th Amendment tells the national government that it can get involved and force the states to treat everyone equally. So we're going to see how the 14th Amendment created a system in which the national government began to restrict the state's flexibility and freedom to create policies. All right, so we've got a nice new name for this type of federalism. What we're describing here, we're calling it cooperative federalism. It creates the idea that the national government and the state governments are working much more closely together, that they are cooperating. You see in the background there, you see a cake. We're going to get to that in a minute. First, what this system describes is this system describes lots more shared areas of policy. But it is not equal sharing. This is where the national government has put limits on the state's flexibility in all of its policy areas. So the states still have the power to make these laws, but under the restrictions that the national government set forward. We will talk about the cake in a second, but you can see in the back we call this marble cake federalism. There's a lot more mixing of the flavors there. And then once again, I want you to look at my Venn diagram, only this time it has changed. There's no longer just a little bit of shared space, but there's actually just a little bit of only state space left. Most of the area that would be state powers looks like it has been swallowed by the national government. And so this is a better description of the national and state government relationship today. We've now got a national government that has way more control over what the states can do in their policy areas. So I want to look at this description that we used for the reserved powers of the states. We had all these areas that we said the states made policies about: education, health and safety, even silly stuff, speed limits, driver's licenses, and things like that. So I want to take a minute and just look at examples of how the national government has restricted the state's ability to make these type of policies. So the states do still have power in these areas, but now that power is limited by what the national government has to say. Start right there with education. States still control education within their territories. However, the national government has created a lot of rules for them. The most obvious one of those rules is the decision in Brown versus Board of Education that states cannot operate segregated school systems any longer. So state school systems must be desegregated. There are other national restrictions on states' ability to run schools, which have had more recent impacts on you guys. One of those would be the No Child Left Behind Act. We saw a picture of that earlier. This was signed by George W. Bush, and he was setting up a system where all the states would have to implement testing for their different subjects so that we could measure the schools. So you guys know in the springtime we have so many tests to take, and that's because a national government policy was created ordering the states to put all these tests in all their classrooms. You guys have also lived through the Obama era Common Core program, where he tried to create a national set of standards that would be taught across all the different schools across the country. So that's an example of policies made by the national government that restrict how the states can run their education programs. We can take any of these categories here: health and safety laws. We have a whole lot of national health insurance laws that came from the Affordable Care Act, or what we call Obamacare. The national government tells the states that they must operate Medicaid insurance programs. So these provide health insurance to people who could not afford that on their own. So those are limits on what the states can do with their citizens there. I've mentioned speed limits as a great example of how the states are able to be flexible, and the states can change policies in a way that best fits the needs of those states. Well, even speed limits were taken over by the national government starting in 1975. The national government created a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit that was the nation's speed limit. That was the fastest you could drive anywhere. And that speed limit lasted from 1975 until they got rid of it in 1995. So even something as little as a speed limit can be restricted by the national government. Their states make their own marriage laws, but the national government has told them that they cannot ban interracial marriage. National government has told them that they cannot ban same-sex marriage. So there's national restrictions there too. Even something as simple as a driver's license. After the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, the national government made the states increase the security requirements on their IDs. Before that, we had states that still didn't even have photos on their driver's licenses and things. So really had to change that to a more national standard. And even now we're getting new, in this next year, we will get new ID requirements that we'd have to use to fly on airplanes. So the national government is creating more policies that states have to adjust to. You guys have done a good job of explaining how the national government restricted the state's flexibility in alcohol laws. States do get to make their own alcohol laws, but the national government used grants to encourage and pretty much force every state to raise their drinking age to 21 if they had not already done so. And our most obvious example here would be in the voter requirements. So those are still left up to states, but you guys know all of the amendments that put restrictions on what the states can do. So the states have to allow people of all races to vote. They must allow people of all genders to vote. They must allow anyone to vote who is a citizen over the age of 18. So those amendments in the Constitution change the state's ability to set requirements for who votes. So states do not have the ability to say only men can vote or something like that. All right, so let's talk about if this is good or not. Let's evaluate this system for just a second, like we did with federalism as a whole. So this is good in some ways. One of the main ways that this is good is if the national government is forcing the states to have more similar policies, then there's a lot less discrimination for us. Okay, we don't have to worry so much about uneven treatment across state lines or uneven services available to citizens and things like that. The more the national government gets involved, the more our policies would be the same everywhere. And you, as a kid growing up in Tennessee, would have a very similar experience as a kid growing up in California or a kid growing up in New York. The bad side of this is we have a lot of people who think that the national government has taken away too much power from the states. And so these things that used to be state issues, they've taken away the advantage that the local government had to create policies that the people in their jurisdiction liked. So that, on one way we can say that it's good to have more uniform policies. It leads to less discrimination for everybody. But on the other side of that, we might say that this takes away the flexibility that the states had to meet the needs of their local citizens. So, cooperative federalism, this is the main way that we're going to talk about federalism because this is how things operate today. This is basically an evolution from dual federalism, from an old idea of separate national and government powers to a new idea of the national government restricting those state powers.